I worked at a distribution warehouse in my early 20s as a night inventory manager. It wasn't one of your massive Amazon-type operations. It was a regional place that supplied maybe a dozen or so smaller businesses in the area. Most nights I'd have a forklift operator and maybe another person to help out, but it wasn't uncommon for me to spend the whole shift by myself. Again, not the biggest facility, so it really wasn't very demanding work. A lot of the time I'd find myself taking longer breaks, just so the night wouldn't drag on forever. This was one of those nights where I was completely alone and just going through the motions. At the beginning of my shift, I grabbed my clipboard and started doing inventory counts in the back section of the warehouse. It doesn't take much mental effort, so my mind was just elsewhere, just thinking about weekend plans, not really paying attention to what I was doing. I went through about 4 rows of shelving until a banging sound from somewhere in the building made me stop in my tracks. I almost didn't realize what it was because I was so zoned out, but once I did, I got really concerned. I heard the banging again, coming from what sounded like the loading dock area. I walked down to the end of the row and looked towards the back of the warehouse, but I couldn't see anything from where I was standing. The loading dock had 3 large bay doors that we kept locked at night, and there were also regular entrance doors on the other side. I walked over there slowly, my footsteps echoing off the concrete floor and metal shelving. When I got to the loading dock, I could see through the small window in the side door. There was a woman standing outside, and she was hitting the door with what looked like the palm of her hand. I went up closer and called out through the door, asking if she needed help. The woman looked directly at me but didn't say anything. She just stared with this blank expression on her face. "We're closed for the night. The office opens at 7 in the morning, I said, raising my voice so that she could hear me through the metal door. The woman continued to stare at me for a few more seconds. Then she slowly turned and walked away towards the parking lot. I watched her through the window until she disappeared into the darkness beyond the range of the security lights. The whole thing was strange to say the least, but I figured maybe she was confused about the hours or looking for a different business. I went back to what I was doing, counting inventory and marking things off my clipboard. The incident with the woman faded in my mind as I got back into the routine of work. By 1:30 AM, I'd finished about half of my counts and was ready to take my break. I left the clipboard on the shelves and walked across the warehouse to the small break room near the front offices. The break room was basically just a table, a few chairs, a microwave and a coffee maker. I heated up some leftovers I'd brought from home and sat there scrolling through my phone while I ate. I was in there for probably 45 minutes, maybe closer to an hour if I'm being honest. I wasn't in any rush since I was ahead of schedule on my inventory counts anyway. After I finished eating, I headed back out into the warehouse. The facility was always a bit eerie at night when you were alone. Just rows of shelving stretching back into the darkness, with only every 3rd or 4th light turned on to save electricity. My footsteps echoed as I walked towards where I'd left off. I was halfway across the floor when I heard something that jolted me. It was the sound of a forklift starting up somewhere in the back section of the warehouse. That distinct beeping sound they make when you put them in reverse, followed by the hum of the motor. I stopped walking immediately and just stood there listening, trying to figure out if I was actually hearing it. The forklift sounds continued, the beeping motor and what sounded like moving between the rows of shelving. My heart started pounding because I knew for certain that I was supposed to be the only one in that building. I'd locked the front entrance when I came in for my shift, and the loading bay doors were also secured. There was no way somebody could have gotten in without me knowing about it. I stood there frozen for probably 30 seconds, just listening to the forklift moving around in the darkness. Then I heard it stop, and the motor shut off. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it towards the back section where the sounds had come from. But I couldn't see anything from where I was standing. I started backing up slowly towards the front offices, keeping my eyes on the dark rows of shelving ahead of me. That's when I heard footsteps, boots on concrete, walking at a steady pace. They were coming from the same area where the forklift had been. I could tell they were getting closer, moving between the rows somewhere in the darkness. My first instinct was to call out and ask who was there, maybe thinking it was a forklift operator who'd come on a late shift. But something in my gut told me to stay quiet. If somebody was supposed to be there, they would have called out to me already or turned on more lights. I continued backing towards the offices, moving as quietly as I could. The footsteps stopped for a second, and I froze again, barely breathing. Then I heard them start up again, but this time they seemed to be moving faster, like whoever it was had started walking with more purpose. They were definitely getting closer to where I was standing. That's when I made the decision to run. I turned and sprinted towards the front offices, my keys already in my hand. Behind me I could hear the footsteps break into a run as well, boots pounding on the concrete floor. Then I started hearing the clang of heavy metal smacking the concrete floor as well. In that moment I knew somebody meant me harm. The sound of it echoed through the whole warehouse, making it impossible to tell exactly how close they were. I reached for the office area and fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door that led to the front entrance. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys and had to snatch them up off the floor. I could hear whoever it was getting closer, their footsteps thundering through the warehouse behind me. I finally got the door unlocked and burst through into the office corridor. There was a door at the end that led outside to the parking lot, and I ran for it without looking back. Just as I reached it and pushed the crash bar open, I heard a loud crack behind me, the sound of something hitting metal or maybe breaking through the drywall. I didn't stop to look. I ran outside into the parking lot, the cold air hitting my face as I sprinted for my truck. I could hear the office door slam open behind me, and I knew whoever was there had followed me outside. I reached my truck and jumped inside, locking all the doors and starting the engine. In my rearview mirror I could see a figure standing in the doorway of the building, just standing there watching me. I threw the truck in reverse and peeled out of the parking spot. As I was driving away, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice was shaking as I tried to explain what had just happened. The dispatcher kept me on the line as I drove to a gas station 2 miles down the road, where I waited for the police to arrive. 2 squad cars showed up within maybe 10 minutes, and after I gave them my statement, they went to check out the warehouse. I waited at the gas station. I was too scared to go back there myself. After about an hour, one of the officers came back and told me what they'd found. The side door at the loading dock, the same one where I'd seen the woman earlier, had been forced open. The metal frame was bent and there were pry marks all around the lock. Inside the warehouse, they found one of the forklifts had been moved from its charging station and left running in one of the back aisles. They also found that the office I'd run through had been vandalized. Papers were thrown everywhere, a computer monitor was smashed, and what looked like a crowbar was left on the floor. But whoever had broken in was gone by the time the police arrived. What really disturbed me was what one of the officers said as they'd finished looking around. He told me that based on the evidence, it looked like whoever had broken in there had been specifically looking for somebody, or sending a message. I quit my job about 2 weeks after the incident. I just couldn't bring myself to go back into that warehouse, especially not alone at night. Even the thought of it made me anxious. I found work at a different company, one where I worked day shifts with other people around. But that incident never left me. I don't understand why that person was there, what they wanted, or why anyone would be after me. Just why? This happened to me about 3 years ago in the late summer of 2022. My friend Alex and I had decided to visit a national park in Northern California. We were both into hiking and we'd planned to spend 2 days out there. Just a few trails, a rented cabin and some peace. It started off like any other weekend trip, but by the end of the day we were lucky to make it back at all. We arrived at midday and parked near the visitor centre and checked out a map. Alex had been here once before and said that he knew a good trail that looped around a ridge and led to a lookout point over the valley. It was supposed to take a few hours for this round trip. It sounded perfect to me. We grabbed our packs and started hiking. The path was clearly marked and there were a few other people around here and there, but it was just nice and calm. After about an hour, we stopped at a small wooden bridge over a stream to rest and have some water, and that's when we noticed a man approaching from along the trail. He looked a little out of place, maybe late 40s. He had a heavy beard and worn clothes that looked like they'd seen a lot of use. He nodded to us as he came closer. He told us it was a good day for hiking, and Alex agreed. Then the man asked if we were heading up to the lookout, and Alex said we were. The man nodded again and then told us that the lookout was fine, but there was a much better spot, one that most people didn't know about. I asked what he meant, and he said there was a clearing just off the trail a few miles further, where you could see both the ridge and a waterfall down into the canyon. He said the view was incredible and that it was quiet. It was a place where no one ever went. The way he was speaking, though, just didn't feel right. Have you ever met somebody who just feels wrong? That's what this guy was like. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. Maybe it was how insistent he seemed. I remember asking Alex where it was on the map, and the man said that it wasn't on there. He said it wasn't official and it was just a little local secret. Then he gave us directions, told us to follow the trail until we saw a fallen pine with a split trunk, then take a narrow path on the right. He said it would lead us straight there. I thanked the guy, though I didn't mean it, and I told him that we'd think about visiting. He nodded again and said that we wouldn't regret it. Then he walked off in the opposite direction. We watched him go until he disappeared down the trail. I told Alex that the guy gave me a weird feeling, that maybe we shouldn't follow the random directions of some strangers out in the woods. Alex laughed and said that I was paranoid. He said the guy was probably just being friendly, and that it'd be cool to check it out. I wasn't thrilled, but I eventually agreed. The day was still bright, and we figured we had plenty of time. We hiked for another 40 minutes until we saw it, the fallen pine the man had described, split down the middle like lightning had hit it. And sure enough, there was a faint path off to the right. It looked barely used, just a strip of earth between overgrown brush. I remember thinking that if something happened out here, no one would ever know. I told Alex it didn't look like a real trail, and he said that's what made it exciting, that maybe we'd find something amazing. So we turned off the main path and followed it. Almost immediately the woods felt different, quieter, the air thicker. I noticed how dim it got under the canopy even though the afternoon sun was still high. The path wound deeper and deeper, and before long I couldn't hear the main trail anymore. No voices, no wind, no insects, just the sounds of our boots and branches snapping underfoot. We kept walking for what felt like forever. I checked my phone, but obviously there was no signal. By now we hadn't seen anybody for over an hour, but I swear I could feel eyes on the back of my neck. At one point I thought I heard something behind us, a quick, light sound like a step. I turned and looked, but there was nothing there. Every time I turned around, the woods seemed to rearrange themselves, like they themselves were hiding something. I told Alex that I thought we should head back, that this was getting weird. He said we'd turn around, but as soon as we'd reached the spot, and that the clearing should just be ahead. A few minutes later, the path opened up to a wide clearing. It certainly wasn't the beautiful overlook that the man had promised. It was something else entirely. There were half a dozen old tents, faded and sagging, arranged in a rough circle. Around them were makeshift shelters built from branches and tarps. Empty cans, torn backpacks, piles of trash. It looked like people had been living there. There was even a rusted metal drum in the middle that must have been used for fires. Alex stopped dead and I remember him whispering that we should leave. This wasn't a campsite. It was a warning that shouldn't be ignored. I nodded and we turned back, and that's when we heard it. A twig snap close by, then another a bit further off. We froze. I whispered that somebody was out there, but Alex didn't say anything. He just looked around with wide eyes. Another sound came from the tree line. Movement, slow, clearly a person. At that moment, I could see faint shapes shifting behind the brush. We started backing away as quietly as we could. I felt every crunch of dirt under my shoes. After a few steps, we dropped low and ducked behind a fallen log. The woods went completely still. Then we heard voices, low, hushed, but close. They were talking, but I couldn't make out the words. It wasn't English, or if it was muffled and distorted. Alex whispered that we should move, and we started creeping along the edge of the clearing, using the brush for cover. Every few seconds I looked back and saw shadows, at least 2, maybe 3, moving through the trees around the clearing. Someone was searching. They knew we were here. In that moment I knew we'd made a huge mistake. They were searching for us. This wasn't some secret spot. It was a trap. We kept low, careful not to make noise. The ground was covered in dry pine needles that cracked under the slightest weight. I was fully aware that one wrong step, one loud breath, they'd find us. Several times I stumbled over roots and almost fell. I caught myself against a tree and froze, my heart hammering. I was sure they'd heard it. One of the figures turned sharply and I saw a glint of something metallic in their hand. Maybe a flashlight, maybe a knife, I don't know. We stayed there, barely breathing, until the figure turned away. We kept moving inch by inch until we were out of sight of the clearing. Then we followed what we thought was the same path back. It was slow, tense and confusing. The woods all looked the same, and the light was beginning to fade now. Every sound made me flinch. The wind in the branches, animals darting across the ground, and distant cracks that sounded too heavy to be animals. At one point, we heard footsteps again, behind us, close enough that I could swear I felt the vibration. We dropped flat and lay still, praying whoever it was would not spot us. Faces pressed to the dirt, through the undergrowth, I saw somebody walk past not 30 feet away. A man, filthy, wearing a torn jacket. He was holding something long in his hand. He stopped suddenly and turned his head, listening. I remember feeling sweat trickle down my neck as I stared at the ground, afraid to even breathe. The man lingered, like he knew somebody was there, but wanted us to make the first move. It felt like they all knew where we were, and that they were just enjoying our torment. After a long time, he continued walking. It took us another half an hour of careful, silent movement before we finally saw the main trail again through the trees. When we stepped out, I nearly cried from relief. The trail looked bright and open, the way normal things look after you've been in the dark for way too long. We didn't speak as we walked back to the car. We just kept glancing behind us to make sure nobody was following. When we finally reached the parking lot, there were a few other cars and a ranger truck. We went straight to one of the rangers and told him what happened. He listened carefully, then asked us to show him on the map where we'd gone. We pointed out the spot where we'd left the main trail. He said that that area had been closed years ago and that nobody should be there. He thanked us for the information, but whether any investigation followed, I don't know. Well, that's my story of why I'll never leave a trail again, and neither should you. For the past 8 years, I've lived a simple life in rural North Dakota. I own a small farmhouse in a county of people living the same lifestyle as me. There's a main street with a general store and a few other businesses, but most people have farmhouses or properties several miles out, with either livestock or just open land. I don't raise livestock or anything, but I do have a lot of open fields that border some foothills. About a year ago now, it was around 8:30 PM one evening, and I was sitting on my front porch reading a book under the dim light. I did this most nights except when the weather was really bad. It was always a peaceful way to wind down before heading to bed, but this evening was different. I was out there for maybe 45 minutes, completely absorbed in my book, when I heard the sound of footsteps on gravel coming around the side of my house. I looked up, seeing a woman standing at the corner of the porch, maybe 20 feet away from me. The woman looked like she could be from around here, middle-aged with dark hair pulled back into a ponytail. She was wearing jeans and a shirt. I stood up from my chair and asked what she needed and how she'd gotten onto my property. The woman stared at me with an expression I could only describe as calculating, like she was sizing me up. But then she looked past me towards my front door. I kept watching her as she began to walk along the side of the porch towards the back of the house. She went right up to one of the rear windows and pressed her face right up to the glass, cupping her hands around her eyes so that she could see inside. She muttered something I couldn't quite hear, then turned and started walking towards my barn. I called out again, demanding to know what she was doing, and added some choice words. But the woman just ignored me completely. She walked all the way across the yard to where my property met the tree line, and then she just disappeared into the darkness. It was absolutely bizarre. Some stranger being out here on my land was no coincidence, especially not at this hour, and the way she was behaving was beyond unusual. It was like she was scouting the place out and had no concern about being caught trespassing. I went inside immediately and locked all the doors and got my shotgun out from the bedroom closet just to be safe. I didn't think she was going to return, but I couldn't be certain of anything at that point. As far as law enforcement goes, calling the sheriff's department out here would take at least 30 minutes to get a response, so it wouldn't help much in an emergency. I was essentially on my own, which is just the reality of living out this far. I stayed up for several more hours, well past my normal bedtime, and kept watch for any signs of trouble. I don't remember exactly what time it was, but it had to be close to 2:30 AM, maybe even 3. That was when I finally dozed off in my recliner. I was fighting to stay awake, but exhaustion won out. When I woke up several hours later though, there was something wrong. The smell of cigarette smoke and an unusual constant sound. The wind blowing through the house. I sat up quickly, still groggy and disorientated, and looked around the living room. Then I noticed the back door in the kitchen was slightly ajar. I got up and walked over to it, looking outside into the early morning darkness, but not seeing anyone. I closed it firmly and locked it, then turned to face the possibility that somebody might still be inside. I stood there in the kitchen for several moments, listening intently for any indication of another person in the house. It was a modest farmhouse with only a few rooms, so even quiet movement would probably be noticeable. But it was completely silent, except for the usual settling sounds of an old house. I carefully moved through each room, checking behind furniture and inside closets, but nobody was there. The cigarette smell was strongest in the living room, right where I'd been sleeping. There was even a faint ash residue on the coffee table that hadn't been there before, and I don't smoke. Someone had definitely been inside while I was unconscious, and they'd been close enough to stand over me while I slept. The thought of it made my skin crawl. After that realization, I couldn't relax at all. As soon as it was light enough outside, I did a thorough check of the entire property, and that's when I found more evidence of an intrusion. My barn door, which was always locked, was hanging open with the padlock missing entirely. Inside, several tools had been moved around and my toolbox had been opened and rifled through. A few items were missing, nothing particularly valuable, just some hand tools and a coil of rope. I also found 2 pairs of muddy boot prints leading from the tree line to the back of my house, then to the barn, and back towards the trees again. One pair were definitely smaller, definitely consistent with a woman's boots. She'd apparently spent considerable time walking around my property while I was passed out in my chair. I drove into town as soon as I'd documented everything and filed a report with the sheriff's department. I gave them a description of the woman I'd seen and explained the timeline of events. That was almost a year ago and I haven't seen the woman again, but I also haven't forgotten the way she looked at me that night. or the knowledge that she stood there in my living room while I was helpless. So what her intentions were, or whoever she was with were, remains a mystery. And without knowing why she came to my property in the first place, there's no way to know if she'll ever come back, or what she might do next time.